Hello, everyone. Welcome to 7 Environmental's Inside ESG, where we meet with leaders in sustainability, climate, and the ESG space. This series aims to provide a clear view into the ever-changing landscape of sustainability practices. I'm Doron, Marketing Director for 7 Environmental, an AI-driven compliance solution focusing on streamlining data collection and reporting for ESG, EHS, and risk management. Our guest today is Andrew Hobbs. Hi, Andrew, and welcome to Inside ESG. Great to have you with us.
Hi, Doron. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Andrew leads EY's public policy team for Europe, Middle East, India, and Africa. Its role is to work with key stakeholders and constructive policy development, so strengthening in the working relationship between the public and the private sector, focusing on key topics including sustainability, reporting, and digital. He is chair of the Corporate Governance Committee of Business at the OECD, the Research Advisory Board of the ICAEW, and the Corporate Governance Working Group of the European Contact Group, whose members comprise the sixth largest accounting network in the EU. Andrew, thanks again for joining us today. Before we dive in, would you mind sharing with us a bit about yourself? And if you can, what's really interesting to me also is to share where your sustainability journey started.
No, thanks, Doron. I'll try to keep it brief because it's fairly long, but I was looking, I actually have, for some reason, I had cause to look back at my career earlier on this year, and I realized that I've spent probably the last 20 years working in and around the topic of corporate governance policy and practice. I started off as a lawyer in private practice in the mid 90s, and there I was working really on the sharp end of corporate governance in terms of corporate failure, and I was dealing with all of sort of the grubby litigation work that arises when big companies fail, so sort of insolvency, fraud, directors disqualifications, that sort of thing. And then I moved in, and there was no I don't think I even understood what sustainability was at that point. I mean, clearly there were things like, I was aware of organizations like Greenpeace, and I think climate change was starting to be talked about, but it wasn't really a topic that I was thinking much about. And then I went in-house in EY, and I was an in-house lawyer for a few years. And then I joined a new public policy team in the mid-2000s, which was really regulatory and quite technical at the time. But then the financial crisis happened. And I think that was really when I started to be aware in the regulatory reform that followed. I started getting more involved with the investment community and how they were interested in us as a public interest audit firm. And the investors that are interested in audit, and quite frankly, that is a niche topic for many investors, but they tended to be the ones that were also interested in ESG, and they were the sort of ESG pioneers. And it was then that I started sort of working with them and getting interested in kind of where do we fit in as a professional services organization with what investors in the ESG space are trying to achieve. And that started making me think about how reporting and assurance policy might adapt to accommodate that. So this was starting to think, we had non-financial reporting at that point, starting to think about those things and where assurance could provide greater confidence. And then I guess that my interest in sustainability really took off with the last European Commission's mandate, where the Green Deal was announced, and where Europe really set this ambitious target to deliver on its Paris Agreement commitments by completely transforming the European economy. Now, that was what they intended, and it hasn't quite gone according to plan, but that was when it really got me interested. And I started working on mandatory sustainability reporting, but we've also broadened out into things like due diligence. And then separately on the board matters side, for reasons which are too boring to go into or too long to go into on this podcast, I started doing some surveying and research work with C-suite members of companies across Europe to look at how they were adapting what they did as boards, as directors, so it's independents and executives, how they were adapting what they did to really deliver on sustainability objectives, whether those were off to the side of the strategy or whether they were integrated in the strategy. And I've been doing that work for about 5 years now. So that's also a sort of the practice side, not the policy side, that I've been working on. So that's what I would say how I got to today.
That's very interesting, and thanks for sharing. If I may, a question about that. That's always interesting. When you said you started approaching and asking C-suite, and you said that this is about 5 years ago, right?
Well, 5 years ago, so we do an annual report, and I'm doing it. So we're
Mhm.
now into our fifth edition. Yeah, so it first started around 5 years ago.
And these executives, was this the first time they heard about it, or were they already, when was this lighting moment for them understanding the importance, or they should have their attention or address it, to say the least?
It's a good question. So, I mean, these are European companies, so that you could
Hmm.
perhaps say they were perhaps more progressive than other parts of the world
Yeah,
even 5 years ago. One of the reasons that we actually started doing the report was because it was at the time that the European Commission was thinking about whether there should be some hard law forcing directors to concentrate on sustainability
yeah.
objectives. That actually went by the wayside because the member states resisted it quite heavily. But what we wanted to find out was whether boards were doing things themselves voluntarily and whether they were getting value out of it. And I think that movement had started with some leaders, Unilever, if I can quote them,
Right.
and others, and sort of more niche companies like Patagonia that have been concentrating on this for a
Mhm.
long, long time. But we were finding that, and I think there's been an interesting development in the 5 years I've been doing it, because at the time, I think when we started, I think everybody felt they should be saying that they were working on it and that they were concentrating on it. And I think where we are now is there's starting to become a bit more of a divergence on the real leaders, the people that see a real value, what Alex Edmonds from London Business School would call rational sustainability. So they really understand why they do it and what value it gives to the business, versus those that don't really see its value, or are perhaps slower followers, and really see it more as a compliance or corporate responsibility issue that's off to the side of their business and doesn't really make a huge difference. But back then they were sort of starting to say they were getting value out of concentrating on sustainability in one way, shape, or form. But what they hadn't done was adapted their governance structures to really
Right.
accelerate it. So it was kind of trying to fit it in amongst all the other things that they were doing.
Interesting. Yeah, I think there's some infrastructure to it. It's not just saying or wanting to do it. It's um yeah, and also nice to see someone else's career started in the 90s. Uh, um, but
Really.
we'll keep that between us. Great, thanks for sharing that. I always like to start a discussion with current events, kind of speaking, things that are happening now. So looking at the turmoil in the market, following US policy changes, what is the impact from your point of view on policymakers in Europe? And and if you have something to add to that, the rest of the world actually, and is there an environmental angle that we should all consider?
Yeah, let me try and answer that. I think that the situation is a lot more complicated
Right.
than media would have you think. So the media angle, certainly in this world, would be, everything's a knee-jerk reaction to the change in the US administration. But
Hmm.
if you look at Europe, where I know best, the the kind of story has evolved over since 2015 with the Paris commitment. So it's a 10-year story. And what you saw there was immense leadership from Europe, in their Paris Agreement commitments, and then a policy program that was designed to deliver on it, against a background of geopolitical movements, against the background of huge increases in the cost of living following COVID, the war in Ukraine, that kind of changed things in a way that policymakers weren't anticipating. Then you saw domestic issues in big member states like Germany and France, where cost of the transition, rightly or wrongly, I mean, I'm not sure whether this is real or perceived, but rightly or wrongly was perceived to be too much for many voters, and including from particular sectors, say agriculture, for example.
Hmm. Yeah.
And that forced the commission really to re-look at what it was doing, and it caused it to have ask more existential questions about, are we setting our economy up for success more broadly, never not just on sustainability.
Right.
And that has resulted in a new commission, a new mandate, which is trying to say, well, we're still committed to net zero and transitioning the economy. We just need to find a different way to do it. And the way that they're trying to find to do it is to really, I mean, it's not a copy of the US IRA because Europe's very different, but it is adopting an approach that says, how can we incentivize this? How can we create new markets, such as clean energy markets, that companies will take advantage of, rather than you've got to report all the 500 data points and will embarrass you transitioning. And I mean, that's a very simplistic way of explaining it. And then in countries like the UK, I mean, they're being more cautious, I would say. They don't have the same fiscal ability to make, to spend or invest or give huge subsidies, given where they're at. So they're being a bit more careful and cautious, but they're still, wrestling with the same questions about how to transition in a way that makes sense for growth for the UK and which makes sense for competitiveness. So I think what we're seeing is countries not abandoning it, but really being more thoughtful and perhaps realizing that they can't go as fast as they've originally intended. So I'm quite optimistic. I think we'll get there, because I think whereas clean countries are perhaps seen as uncompetitive in today's world, they will become the most competitive in time. There's no doubt about it. So this is a timing question. It's a when, not if.
Thanks for that. And I like how you ended that it is a timing question, and interesting to see that countries that you say that they are actually very competitive, and we'll just see it, as always in business, let's look at the long run, which is always easy and challenging at times, but makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, not easy when your sort of election cycle works every 5 years, and
for sure, really we're all the same ecosystem. Yeah. I'd like to challenge that and kind of look at the broader picture. As you mentioned, you talked about Europe, and in many cases, and we started that with saying, not everything is exactly as we see on media. That's about the US, but we do see most of the media coverage is around the US and Europe, for that matter. And as someone who is involved and knows about policy makers and about policy and as you mentioned, public and private sector across the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and India, could you share a little bit more about how sustainability regulations is progressing in other regions as Africa, India, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's a very large area. I mean, I cover nearly 90.
It's most of the world.
Yeah, most of the world. There's 98 countries in total. So, and the approach is different. I've talked about Europe. I mean, there, it's moving from incentives away from regulation and trying to simplify, at least in theory. But in the Middle East, I mean, you've got things like water scarcity there, which have been felt. There's been interest in a rise in mandatory ESG reporting and net zero commitments there, particularly in countries like Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia. They're investing heavily in renewable energy and sustainability initiatives. I mean, you've probably heard of Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 for energy, and UAE's Energy Strategy 2050, which looks at scaling cleaner energy, including renewables. So they're definitely getting into it. In Africa, clearly climate change is really, I mean, in many places around the world, but Africa particularly, climate change effects are really felt. Droughts, flooding, desertification, and there's growing focus there on sustainable development and climate action. I was at COP in Azerbaijan last, and was really interested to meet African colleagues there and to sort of understand not just their challenges, but how they're seeking to innovate and monetize actually the stewardship that they exercise over some great nature-based resources, and to kind of to get investment in those assets from global markets, but in a way that it isn't seen as aid. This is seen as investment in either preserving nature or preserving assets which actually have a net climate or net environmental positive effect. And that's outside of sort of regulation, but the COP kind of framework and discussions and dialogues do help sort of develop those things. But in terms of, I'm just trying to think what else I can talk about. South Africa, I think just last week, South Africa adopted its Climate Change Act, which establishes a legal framework for climate action. And that's
Well,
I'm there is to encourage a just transition through accelerating emissions reductions and supporting climate adaptation efforts at the same time. And then India, I mean, India's got its own environmental challenges as well, but I mean, they've been ahead of the game for a long time. I mean, they've had sustainability regulation for a number of years, and I believe I'm right in saying that they were the first country in the world to have mandatory ESG reporting. I think they were ahead of Europe. They've got their own standards. There's mandatory assurance. It's a stock market requirement. So there's lots of initiatives going on all around the world to address this patchwork, if you like. And then, of course, I haven't mentioned things like international efforts where you've got efforts like organizations like the International Sustainability Standards Board that have developed some very strong standards on the E side, which are being promoted and sold, if I can use that word, globally. I haven't got the figures and the number of countries that have committed to use it, but it's a lot. If you kind of take away the EU, it's got its own standards, and the US that's doing its own thing. There's a whole bunch of other countries there that many of which are interested in using those standards.
Well, thank you for sharing. As I said, in many cases you see on media mostly about US policy, Europe, UK to some extent, and as you mentioned, through COP and through other means, we should definitely cover more on the other regions, and from some of them, as you say, some of them are actually the first to the game in some cases. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Going back a bit into the EU, considering recent changes in policy and regulations in the US and following changes to CSRD specifically, what effect would these changes have on sustainability in the private and the public sector in Europe, in your opinion?
It's a great question. Let's just take the basic thing first. So the basic thing is, if I'm a company, I will, at the very basic, want to say I need to be compliant with the laws and regulations that I'm subject to. It doesn't matter what it's on. So whatever happens, whatever the level of regulation that exists, companies will follow that. I mean, very few won't. You then come down to the sustainability as a strategic issue, and and this is where I think some of and this is slightly spoiler alert because we haven't released the report that I mentioned earlier yet this year. The statistics in there seem to be showing, out of the 200 that we surveyed, that there's a bit of a gap growing between those that were being dragged along by the regulation and weren't really sold on the idea, and then other companies, leaders, if I can call it that say this makes complete business sense. And that's either because it's all about margins and profitability. It's either because it's all about new products and services. It's all about managing risk. They're saying, well, I want to be here in the long term, and therefore I've got to take account of the market and the environment in which I work, and that needs to be, I need to be able to operate. And even think for intrinsic things like, well, I need to be committed to a sustainability strategy because I won't recruit people unless I won't recruit the best people unless I do. So,
Right.
So that I think I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way is that the ones that get it in terms of the business imperative will continue through the political cycle. So whatever that might be. So I'm quite positive, really, because the planet continues to warm up, but there are great opportunities here. Consumers are demanding things, new products and services. So we've got a need to manage our resources a lot easier, and not just for kind of green reasons, but for security reasons and resilience reasons. And so I'm pretty positive that many companies will continue whatever the regulatory environment. And indeed, there's plenty of data out there to suggest that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. We see a lot of companies. You mentioned Patagonia before, and other companies which are not small companies that make an effort. And as for consumers, I think before we hit the record button, we mentioned I see even my kids speak a different language than we do, and they're future. Not future. They're actually current consumers already. So I would say you see they speak a different language. They expect different things, which I think that's the awesome thing about it. They expect a different world. It's not that they're asking for it, not demanding, they expect it to be like that. So I'm with you, I'm optimistic to that matter also. Moving a bit aside from policy, which is really interesting, and as you said, each one of your answers could be a whole podcast by itself, and this is I'm really having a great time here. But moving to something closer to also recent events, technology leap that's going around us, and some say have called the last year bigger than the Industrial Revolution, addressing developments in AI specifically. How do you see innovation impacting sustainability and ESG for that matter?
Yeah, another good question. We did some work on it, and maybe for your listeners, we can provide a link to it. But we did some research in last year's report that I mentioned, that one that we where we poll boards and C-suite, and we asked about AI because last year everyone was talking about it. I mean, people are still talking about it now, but and the thing about AI and sustainability is it can be both an enabler but also a challenge. You know, on the challenge side, it's a huge user of energy. I don't know if you'd spotted the sort of the crisis that happened this week at Heathrow Airport with one of the electric substations going down. And I was listening to the radio, someone being interviewed about it on the radio and noting that there was a data center right next to this substation, whose spare wattage capacity was 3 or 4 times that used by Heathrow. So I mean, the energy that's used by IT and particularly AI is massive, and so that is a one level a challenge. But it also, in terms of managing your costs, it's a huge potential motivator to move towards clean and renewable energy. And then on the sort of again on the plus side, AI has got great potential for managing energy use. It's got great potential for helping track data information to enable us to work out whether we are progressing against the goals that we are setting ourselves in areas where, you know, numerical data or quantitative data may not be readily available, or if it is, it's all over the place. So I think AI has a huge role potentially there to help us create and maintain that dashboard that we need to know if we're driving at the right speed and in the right direction. And then there's this sort of, and this is an emerging area for me, which I don't really have an opinion yet, and I haven't worked out whether it's going to be a game changer or will end up being a kind of damp squib, which is how the board uses AI to actually discharge its duties. So how can I use AI to be an advisor or an assistant to me as a director on a board as I look at a huge morass of information? How does it help me handle risk? How does it help me ask good questions? Those kind of things, which is not directly related to sustainability, but I think it goes directly to governance. And as those who are interested in the investor community, well-governed companies tend to look after the environment and society quite well anyway, because they know that it's in their ultimate long-term interests as businesses.
I agree. So basically, it's just saying it. So AI actually goes into the same bucket as we said before. It's about looking at the long term, and we actually discussed this also in the previous chapter with talking about the needs for more and more energy, as you said, more than Heathrow Airport needs, and about how solar and wind power is will probably the most cost-effective solution there. Interesting, and definitely, please share the link, and we'll share it in the description of this episode. Absolutely. Before we wrap up, you won't believe it, we are getting close to the end of this. One last question I like to ask all my guests is, again, and I think it's very relevant to sustainability, is what motivation and drivers do you see evolving in the near future for sustainability, near future or long term? As I see, we've been discussing a lot about the long term in this episode.
Yeah, this is a great question. I was trying to think of something. I thought long and hard about this because I wanted to say something that perhaps others aren't saying, or not that it's unique or new, or it's just pointing at something that perhaps people haven't thought of. And I alluded to it earlier, which is, and this is to an extent, this is quite a European phenomenon, is the relevance of sustainability to security and defense. And what do I mean about that is that if you look at Europe, the way that Europe becomes self-sufficient in energy is through renewables. So it wants to decouple itself from relying on fossil fuels from places that may or may not be friendly or remain friendly, and so wants to de-risk itself. And I think that will be an interesting dynamic that governments concentrate on to, say, make themselves resilient. So in other words, clean energy is resilient energy. Also, sort of resource use, minimizing resource use again to reduce dependencies on others. I think that will be a big driver as well. But that's alongside the business and commercial drivers that I talked about earlier. But I think that's the dynamic that I think we'll see.
Thank you. That's a lot to think about. And as I think this is another question we can do we'll probably have to schedule another 45 minutes just for that. Talk about and I like the resilient energy term. I'll probably use it more and give you credit when needed.
You're welcome. You're welcome to it.
So that's great. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me and having this talk with us today. I'm sure our listeners got a lot from it. And is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, nothing to say. It's been a pleasure. And if any of your listeners want to reach out, they can find me on LinkedIn. More than happy to talk. I love meeting and talking to people that are interested in this agenda, both policy and practice. I think it's super important. I think we will get there. I just think it might be not a straight line, and there'll be twists and turns along the way.
Amazing. As you mentioned, if anyone has any further question or would like to reach out, you can find Andrew Hobbs on LinkedIn or reach out through the EY UK website. Thank you. Thanks everyone for listeners for joining us today. If you have any questions for 7E or for me, send us an email to hello@7environmental.com or reach out to us on LinkedIn. For more Inside ESG, subscribe to our channels on YouTube and Spotify. Andrew, thank you again for joining us and for this discussion. And see you all next time. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Goodbye.